Okay, I see folks are still trickling in, but I'll just go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining us today for this webinar on sustainable jobs and just transition in Canada. My name is Laura Cameron. I'm a policy advisor with IISD working on just transition and oil and gas phase out work. And I'm very happy to be moderating this panel today with a series of amazing speakers. I want to begin by recognizing where I am. I'm calling in from Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, as well as the homeland of the Red River Métis. And today, this week, on the eve of the third National Truth and Reconciliation Day, I've been thinking a lot about the intersections of our work, this conversation on just transition and Indigenous rights and sort of the history, the truth of colonization in Canada, historically and ongoing, and the displacement of Indigenous peoples to build our current carbon-intensive economy. And there's no just transition and there's no construction of a green economy without recognizing the central role of Indigenous peoples and their rights. And so we'll get further into that into today's discussion. Before we get started, I just wanted to cover a few housekeeping notes. So those who are familiar with the Zoom webinar format will know at the bottom of the screen, you'll find a Q&A box. So we encourage folks to put their questions into the Q&A box. And we'll go to audience questions after we hear short presentations from our panelists. There's also a chat box where you can put other comments or feedback that are not questions. So just by way of a short introduction before I hand it over to our experts here, we saw this week with the IEA's Net Zero report shows very clearly, again, emphasizing that there's no room for new fossil fuel production in our future, that oil and gas demand globally is expected to peak this decade on a path to net zero and reduce thereafter. And Canada really needs to be prepared for this scenario and have a managed transition with direct participation from Indigenous communities, workers, and civil society. And we actually held a conversation very much like this one a year ago, talking about what we might expect from and hope for in the just transition legislation from the federal government. And so over the course of the past year, we've seen the government take a few steps forward on just transition and sustainable jobs, tabling the interim Sustainable Jobs Action Plan, as well as draft sustainable jobs legislation this summer. And so the Act will be moving forward for amendments this fall and throughout the year. And meanwhile, the government will be making decisions around funding needed to put these plans into action. So today we're going to hear from 4 experts on where we're at with just transition policymaking in Canada, sort of an update, the current lay of the land, and feedback that folks have on the direction that we're going and the road ahead. And just to note that we were supposed to have a 5th speaker with us today, Brian Fung from Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, but something came up, he wasn't able to make it, so we hope to have him join us for a future conversation. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Megan Gordon from the Pembina Institute. Megan is a senior analyst on Pembina's Equitable Transition team. Before joining Pembina, Megan worked with Environment and Climate Change Canada, actually, as a policy advisor with the Net Zero Advisory Body Secretariat. She was also Secretariat staff member to Canada's Just Transition Task Force, where she coordinated and participated in consultations with workers and communities impacted by the phase out of coal-fired electricity. Over to you, Megan.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm just going to take a second to share my screen and confirm that folks can see that in the way that I'm hoping you can. No, okay, fabulous. Thank you so much to Laura and the folks at IISD for organizing this panel and for the opportunity to speak today. Thanks for the great introduction. For those of you who don't know, Pembina Institute is a national nonprofit clean energy think tank with offices across Canada. And today I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations in what's otherwise known as Vancouver. So I'm hoping to provide you today with a bit of background information on the sustainable jobs policy environment, as well as a bit of a breakdown of the Government of Canada's current plans to advance this important file. So Pembina and many of the wonderful NGOs on this call have been working hard to advance some of the labor and environmental interests through coalition work and developing some proposed amendments to the Sustainable Jobs Act. My presentation is more focused on some of the findings from a recent report that Pembina published just 2 days ago. This is what we're calling our Sustainable Jobs Blueprint for Canada, and it's been developed with the Canadian Labour Congress as well. Speaks broadly to our advice for a robust governance framework that we want to underpin future action. But just to put everything in context today, I'll start by positioning some of the remarks that you hear with the current landscape of what we're seeing. So there's a few things we believe to be true. First, it's clear that the global energy transition is well underway. There are 70 countries around the world that have committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And we've also started to see many of those jurisdictions take a leadership role when it comes to implementing ambitious programs to support workers and communities who are affected by the move away from fossil fuels. Furthermore, Canada has deep roots in the natural resource sector, and we've seen the impacts of major shifts in other sectors like coal, forestry, and fisheries. And there are plenty of lessons to account for when it comes to moving our society and economy to a net zero emission scenario. And what we really know, we need an approach to support communities and workers on the front lines of changes and do more to capitalize on the benefits of clean energy. Taking just a step back, I wanted to unpack some of the factors that are driving transition and affecting employment. Firstly, it's important to remind folks that as a major oil and gas producer, Canada's economy is highly integrated with global markets. And as a result, the global price of oil has been a driver of swings in employment. So just as an example, the collapse of the oil price in 2014 resulted in the loss of about 35,000 jobs in the Canadian oil and gas sector, and that just took place over the course of about 2 years. Secondly, investors are starting to recognize the merits of a clean energy transition and the shift in values towards environmental conscientiousness. And we see more and more investors making investments in companies with strong ESG or environmental, social, and governance standards. Thirdly, policies like the Inflation Reduction Act that have come out of the US involve billions in tax incentives and spending in clean energy. And that makes America a highly appealing investment climate, which really impacts the competitiveness of Canadian firms and industries. And then finally, of course, we're dealing with labor trends like automation, aging population, and labor shortages that are impacting the composition of the workforce. So all in all, it's easy to buy into some of the narratives that we see in the media that attribute job losses to domestic policy decisions or climate action. But we argue that that makes for a really overly simplistic explanation when there are, in fact, a multitude of factors that are influencing change and occurring simultaneously that fly under the radar. Just as an example, a report by Clean Energy Canada finds that jobs in the oil and gas sector are set to decline by at least 93% between 2025 and 2050. And that's regardless of whether or not key climate measures like carbon pricing are in place. So effectively, clawing back climate action is not going to protect oil and gas workers. And so for those folks, it does paint a relatively bleak picture, but there is a positive spin to this story. So again, as Laura mentioned, the IEA predicts that there will be about 2 clean energy jobs created for every fossil fuel job lost. And that comes out of that analysis that she mentioned that was released 2 days ago. And of course, we understand that those are really high level numbers, and it doesn't really mean much to the folks in oil and gas communities or in communities at risk of transition. It doesn't capture the very real disruptions that transition will cause and the changes that will result for communities who rely on fossil fuels. But through Pembina's work with CLC, we're hoping to provide some national and regional analysis about impacts that will occur and how to mitigate those through our work. That's just an aside. The main message here is we know that change is inevitable, and we need a plan to mitigate those potential negative or unintended consequences. We need to keep pace with the United States and the rest of the world, and we need to capitalize on opportunities that present themselves to benefit Canadian society and especially equity-deserving folks. So really, what we're asking for is a plan. The government of Canada has taken those early steps in doing so, and that plan needs to ensure that decent work standards that have been fought for and earned in traditional natural resource sectors are made available and transfer over to the net zero economy. So the sustainable jobs policy environment in Canada is relatively new, especially at the federal level. It really only goes back to about 2018 when Canada launched its Just Transition Task Force for coal power workers and communities. And one of the big asks of the task force was to enable sustainable jobs legislation, which of course we're now quite thrilled to be seeing brought forward to committee discussion and second reading for this fall. There's another additional milestones here on the slide that I won't go into detail. The main message here is that, we are at this place where we're seeing some really strong action. And that leads me to the next section of this presentation, where I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we want to see to build off of these existing commitments. So again, as I mentioned, Pembina and CLC have partnered to develop an implementation blueprint for the Government of Canada to strengthen current and future sustainable jobs plans. And that rests on three principles. First of all, workers need to be involved in the process to avoid the mistakes of the past. We also need to see strong sustainable jobs plans that leverage the opportunities created by the net zero transition, and that those opportunities are specifically made available to displaced workers. And finally, we want to see decent work and good job standards, and those have to be the foundation of this new economy for a transition to be considered fair and orderly, and to avoid exacerbating inequities in society. So our report is part one of a two-part series which aim to provide advice to the Government of Canada on how to put the structure in place to advance sustainable jobs. This first report, the governance recommendations to support Canada's clean energy and workforce and economy, it really looks at those governance aspects, as mentioned in the title. It draws heavily on the mechanisms outlined in the Act that achieve accountability, coordination, and engagement with Canadians. And Matt from EcoJustice, who's also on the call, will speak a little more to those in his presentation. The second part of our report, we expect to come later in the fall, will really more focus on the investments and implementation of this structure. So our report proposes this governance framework that sets out the elements, implementation tactics, and enabling factors for success. I won't go into too much detail on this slide, but just to give you a sense of what we believe the recipe for success is. It's just a little bit of a teaser for those of you interested in our report to get more information. But to dive in on a few of those details, when we're talking about implementation mechanisms, we're talking about proactive and responsive supports that complement one another. So on the proactive side, workers and communities really need to, whoa, sorry, I've just jumped ahead there. Forgive me, my slippery hands. So on the proactive side, those kinds of supports need to ensure that workers and communities are prepared. And they need to ensure that there's growth in industries of the future that's set up for success, and that they have access to a skilled net zero compatible workforce. The proactive side of things also ensures that regional economies are diversified enough to cushion and respond to the volatility and change that we're seeing not only now and in the past, but in the future. Proactive work also involves doing better when it comes to equity and finding ways to ensure that the wealth of the clean energy economy is more fairly distributed. And specifically, that looks like unlocking barriers to more diverse participants in the workforce, as well as expanding participants in project ownership. On the reactive side, we're talking about addressing impacts, connecting workers with new opportunities, and supporting communities. And both of these areas fall into three major policy buckets, which we're calling economic development, workforce development, and social security broadly. There's a great deal of crossover between those three buckets, and there are many, many policy portfolios that kind of extend beyond those three buckets. And that's why we really believe that there needs to be this robust governance framework that manages the breadth and the level of complexity of this issue. And we want to move away from introducing patchwork and disparate programs and operating in silos. So to highlight our enabling factors for success, first of all, we think we need adequate resourcing, and that resourcing needs to match the pace and scale of transition that we're seeing, both on the technological side and on the institutional and governance side. Secondly, jobs need to be aligned with net zero pathways. Otherwise, there's a risk that they'll be left behind if these industries become phased out or uneconomic. Third, we want a cohesive strategy that is clearly articulated to workers. And, of course, we're dealing with technological uncertainty, and the pathways to 2050 are somewhat fuzzy beyond the targets currently set to 2030. So that there's still some decisions that need to be made, but those do need to be made quite quickly. And again, communicating what role workers will actually have in a net zero economy is essential. And then getting to the regional collaboration elements, we recognize that transitions unfold at the regional and local level, and implementing tactics need to be grounded in local values. As well, different orders of government need to work together to advance tailored policy solutions that account for the constitutional divides of power between the provinces and the federal government. Social dialogue is something that folks may be familiar with. That's a central tenet of this work as well. It involves all parties related to work coming together to share information, build consensus, and using those steps as a vehicle to shape future policy direction and to communicate about transition. And then lastly, workers will be more amenable to change if they have the right tools and information. And there are significant risks of not involving workers early in the process, which could lead to resistance and stalled climate action. So worker buy-in is a critical piece of this. I'll end my comments here for now, but just want to end with a note too, and an invitation to please get in touch with us. Stay tuned for the second iteration of work that really focuses on those investment and program areas where we want to see more skills training and economic growth opportunities. My contact information is here on the slide, so please, again, don't hesitate to get in contact with me or connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter. I'll be posting updates about our work as it unfolds. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Megan. What a whirlwind. You really provided a great background there and also dug into some of the details of your work, which is amazing. So next, I'll pass it off to Kara Sanders, who will talk a little bit more about sustainable jobs in the context of Indigenous clean energy projects. Kara Sanders is an Anishinaabe Kwe from Curve Lake First Nation and is the founder of Aski Environment, Inc., the chair of the Indigenous Clean Energy Board of Directors, and a 2016 Catalyst. Kara has worked with many nations, guiding them to reduce their carbon footprint and creating energy plans, including capacity building and training with youth. Over to you, Kara.
Okay, screen share. Let's see how I can do this. Share. We practice this, but it's always pressure, right?
We see your slides. There we go. Perfect.
Okay. Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending where you are in the country. Miigwech Megan, that was a fantastic presentation, very informative. Lots of great research and lots of great framework. I am not an expert on just transition. I understand the theories, I understand the challenges, I understand the lessons that need to be done, and I'm hoping that I can put a little bit of an Indigenous angle on things that need to be done, how transition needs to occur. So today I am in Treaty 5 in Northern Ontario. I'm in the land of the community of Kanchkum First Nation. I've been working here like 6 years with youth-based employment. We have a boiler in place, a sawmill. We have 5 to 10 youth employed. Anyway, I'd like to thank, I acknowledge the land that I'm on right now, Treaty 5, but also I want to acknowledge the land that everybody else is sitting on today. And as it was spoke, we're on the eve of the Truth and Reconciliation Day. And this is a really important milestone, landmark event for First Nation people, because we're starting to heal and we're starting to find our way, and recognizing the challenges is very important. We always need to thank Mother Earth for her gifts, and we need to think of the other people and the challenges they face as we move on in our lives. As Laura said, I am First Nation. Curve Lake First Nation is my grandmother's community. My grandfather's community, Amjawang, is my grandmother's community in Southern Ontario. I've been a part of the Indigenous Clean Energy Program since 2016. That has been a whirlwind for me, like such learning, such changing, such power of these people. You know, my passion is youth. As I said, I'm up here in Pekanjikam, and I've created employment and opportunities in a community that has 90%, 95% unemployment. So the things that we do really do make a difference. So when I look at just transition, I look at it more in the Indigenous lens and how working with the Indigenous people will change things. One of the roles that I've had the last many years with Indigenous Clean Energy is I've kept a First Nation database. And there are currently over 1,200 projects in Canada with First Nation ownership of some sort. There's 100 that are coming down the pipeline. They should be in 23, 24. In the past 3 years, there's been 50 projects with First Nation ownership. In the last 5 years, there's been over 120 projects. So Indigenous clean energy is real, it's moving, and it's working in a positive manner. I work with youth, as I've said, and I want to help them have a better future, a positive future, and working on sustainable off-grid programs. I don't normally like reading slides. I like have more pictures, but I didn't really have pictures that work on this type of thing. The foundation of just transition must recognize and acknowledge the rights and sovereignties of Indigenous people, including the right to free and prior and informed consent and full implementation of the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. So what does that mean to me? So as a First Nation person, I believe that the earth is our mother. Water is life. Father sky, Mother Earth, grandfather stars, and grandmother moon. Those are the essence of our teachings, of our culture, of our beliefs. So the transition away from mining into other things, the fossil fuels, is important. It is important to heal her. So what does that mean to me? It means that First Nation people have rights. It means that we need to create a fair slate so that Indigenous perspectives are heard and acknowledged and embraced. Sometimes First Nation people Indigenous people aren't able to express as well as others, and this can seem that it means that they agree when it isn't that way. It means creating balanced and meaningful employment and opportunities. So for being in Pekanjikam, for example, it took me many years to be able to have clear, open conversations. And that isn't something that happens as quick as it does for other cultures, being able to speak and embrace and say what you really mean. It means better homes. So, I mean, the transition to clean energy is building better homes in the community, building net zero homes, building sustainable homes. You know, it means letting Mother Earth heal. That's integrating clean energy. Indigenous people do have a voice, and they need to be consulted, and it needs to be fair and just. Everyone has their ideas of what just transition means, and Megan really did do an excellent job explaining the legislation of it, the rulings of it, but mine's more of a personal thought. I'm here in Pekanjikam right now, and gas costs $3.60 a liter. So that's important that we move to renewable energies. And I mean, that won't change cars, but last year was the first year that we had the wood chip boiler going. And in 4 months, we saved 27,000 liters, which we sold for 50,000. So just transition to me is creating more sustainable, more renewable type things, more clean energy. Right now, Treaty 9 First Nations, Kitchener-Mekusip, Casablanca, Martin Falls, Wapakika, they're all in Toronto protesting, trying to speak with Doug Ford about the Ring of Fire. And the Ring of Fire is a great program, but it's not a great program. You know, they're looking at you know, end-to-end renewable energy, renewable parts for renewable cars. So how do you use that mining in a good way, and how do you not make it sustainable? How do you make it positive? So how do we get there? For First Nation Indigenous people, I believe it's in housing. We need to start with deep retrofits and net zero housing design so things are made better and they last longer. Include practices for Indigenous and remotes and rurals. It's estimated 8 to 9 billion to get First Nation Indigenous homes into where it needs to be. And then you add employment, that's another 50 years of employment opportunity for Indigenous people. This is going to change for the next generations, having the training, having the opportunity to move forward. Jobs and skills goes back to the housing, but it also goes into renewable energy. Indigenous Clean Energy Program, Generation Power, these are employment-based programs that work on the just transition of, sorry, my son is changing batteries. Smart grids, microgrids, all of the renewable energies for the off-diesel communities, off-grid communities. This is all important part of the transition. So putting funding toward these opportunities will be a part of just transition for Indigenous. And lastly, working on the bioeconomy. For example, here in Pikangikum, the wood that we use for the boiler is either slab wood from the sawmill, or it's wood that they have used to clear houses, clear the roads. So we're not cutting trees, we're using wood that's already been. So it's a matter of using things that are already there to reduce waste and help improve things. And that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you, Kara. It's very special and generous that you have taken the time when you're really on the ground doing this transition work to, you know, weigh into this conversation and provide, critical insight that helps ground, I think, the often theoretical or high-level policy conversations in, you know, what's happening on the ground. So next I'll turn it over to Matt Hulse, who is a lawyer at EcoJustice. He joined EcoJustice in 2020 to work on climate accountability, and we've spent much of the past year working together on just transition legislation. Prior to joining EcoJustice, Matt was an associate at Woodward & Co., working for Indigenous communities on environmental assessments and conservation of endangered species. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Laura. Let me just set up my screen here. Okay, so
Matt, we can see your
presentation screen. Yeah,
yes.
Classic. Okay, how's that?
That looks good.
Okay. So thank you, Laura, and thank you, IISD, for hosting this. Yes, my name is Matt Hulse, and I'm a lawyer at EcoJustice, based in Victoria, BC, which is the home of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, today known as the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. EcoJustice is an environmental law charity that undertakes pro bono public interest environmental law files. We have offices across Canada, in various cities across coast to coast, and we use the power of the law through litigation and legislative reform, as we're talking about today, to defend nature, combat the climate crisis, and fight for a healthy environment for all. So I am going to talk about Bill C-50, the Canadian Sustainable Jobs Act, which, as it says in the legislation, is an act respecting accountability, transparency, and engagement to support the creation of sustainable jobs for workers and economic growth in a net zero economy. And as we'll talk about later, the term sustainable jobs and the term net zero economy are really the goals of this legislation, and they're kind of key in framing the action that we take to under this legislation. So some of the key elements of Bill C-50 are broken down into 5 buckets here. So definitions and principles, the Sustainable Jobs Action Plan, the Sustainable Jobs Partnership Council, the Sustainable Jobs Secretariat, and reporting. So under definitions and principles, there's 2 key terms that are defined in the legislation that really stand out. The first is net zero economy, which, as I said, is one of the achievement of which is one of the goals of the legislation. And the second is social dialogue, which is the process by which governments, workers, and employers should work together to advance the transition. The principles are found in the preamble of the legislation, and they will guide Canada's approach to building the net zero economy. And they include such things as building social consensus through engagement, supporting decent, high quality jobs, being inclusive and addressing barriers to employment for those who are underrepresented in the labour market. The preamble also refers to Canada's climate commitments, the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which I have provided as an acronym there, and the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And they are useful things to include. More than useful things. We're glad to see they've been included. The next bucket is the action plan, and the Act requires an action plan every 5 years, starting in 2025, and the legislation kind of sets out the things that should be included in the plan and requires that it is informed by input from various stakeholders and the Partnership Council. And the Council is going to be established in the coming year and would include up to 15 members. And the legislation breaks down the knowledge, expertise, and experience that the minister, when selecting these members, or the government, when selecting these members, will consider in choosing who should sit on the council. And they're looking for a balance of folks from labour, from industry, and Indigenous peoples. And the role of the council is to provide independent and ongoing advice to the minister in drafting things like the action plan, as well as engaging with workers, unions, industry, and Canadians on topics that the council feels are relevant. The Secretariat is kind of the nucleus of the government's work on the legislation, and it leads a whole of government approach. It is unusual, I would say, to see a unit within government to be established by legislation like this. But the legislation does that, and it sets out the features of the Secretariat's role, which include developing and implementing the action plan, coordinating federal departments involved in implementation, and tracking the progress of the plan, the action plan, and providing support to the council. And then in terms of reporting, there are a couple of different types of reports. There's the annual report from the council about the advice they provided and the activities they've undertaken over the past year. The minister is then required to respond to that report, which introduces a nice feature of dialogue between the two. And the minister is also required to publish progress reports on the action plan every 5 years, starting in 2028, which is halfway between one action plan and the other. And that provides basically an update on the progress of the action plan over those preceding years. So there are some areas of improvement that we'd like to see in the legislation. So the first being that some of the definitions we feel are inadequate. And one that jumps out to us is the definition of net zero economy, which is lifted, the definition is lifted from the Canadian Net Zero Accountability Act. And essentially this definition just says that a net zero economy is one that balances anthropogenic emissions into the atmosphere with removals from the atmosphere, which is a very technical definition that pertains to just emissions. And in a net zero economy, we think is much more broader, and therefore the definition should reflect that breadth. Some of the key terms in the legislation aren't actually defined, and one in particular is sustainable jobs. And we appreciate this very difficult thing to pin down what a sustainable job is, because there's many facets of sustainable jobs. But we think that it is important to clarify this term, as it's a key goal of this legislation. So we're looking forward to ways in which we can do that in the legislation. The principles, which are in the preamble, are not linked to the action plan, council, or secretariat in an explicit way, which creates the risk that those key mechanisms, key actors under legislation, don't have to align their activities with those principles. So to provide at least peace of mind, it would be very helpful for the legislation to link explicitly, require those actors and mechanisms to explain and align how they align themselves with the principles in their actions. With respect to the action plan, we think there's scope for greater specificity with relation to the contents of the action plan, to ensure that Canadians, when reading the plan, can very clearly see what Canada is doing, when, how much it will cost, who is responsible within government for those actions. And the action plan doesn't explicitly require to consider the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability, the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act Emissions Reduction Plan, which is one of the key drivers of emission reductions at the federal level in Canada. And those two pieces of legislation, as we'll talk about in a moment, are pretty complementary, and therefore the plans under those two pieces of legislation should also speak to each other and consider the work that each is doing. With respect to the Partnership Council, we feel that the knowledge, expertise, and experience required for the members is too narrow. And since the Just Transition is a economy-wide endeavor, it needs to reflect the diversity and scope of Canadians and the Canadian economy. We also feel it doesn't specify who the council will engage with. And we understand that that could be left to the terms of reference, but there's key groups that we feel are pretty important to continue to for the council to engage with throughout its lifespan over the life of legislation, and we feel that should be embedded in the legislation itself to make that very clear. With respect to the Secretariat, we feel there's scope to expand its responsibilities, and we're also concerned that it might not be adequately staffed to undertake the task of doing the work of bringing government together to move this legislation forward. We understand it could be as low as 6 staff members, and we think that's much too low for what this task requires. And finally, with respect to reporting, the 5-year period for annual reports is too long. And we understand some of the reasons that this has been established in order to align with the emission reduction plan under the Emissions Accountability Act. But also, we need to find some way, therefore, to keep this report reflective of the ongoing transition, which could be much more nuanced and occur at a greater rate than 5 years. And finally, so there's some broader things that we want to talk about in terms of areas for improvement. Climate in general. We view this legislation as climate and job legislation, in which it sets a framework for jobs and the economy to persist in a world that addresses climate change. So we want to see a greater connection to climate goals. We don't see any mention of the transition away from high-emitting industries, which is going to be a key feature of the road to net zero. And as I mentioned a couple of times, there's no real connection, adequately connection to the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, which is Canada's key climate legislation. And finally, with respect to regional planning, the just transition will occur across Canada in different ways, in different regions. And this legislation is federal legislation, so it looks at a national scope. But we still feel there's room for the federal government to undertake action on the ground and facilitate action on the ground, but there's no mechanism in this legislation to do that. So this is what we're recommending as a group of a coalition of NGOs. Definitions and principles. We'd like to see an expanded definition of the net zero economy. We'd like to see a definition of sustainable jobs. We would like the legislation to explicitly require the action plan, council, and secretariat to advance and align with the principles in the legislation. With respect to the action plans, we would like the legislation to specify that an action plan should include the following: milestones, measures, the responsible departments for those measures, the timelines for implementation, the costs of implementation, and the monitoring required, so that it's very easy to see, for Canadians to see when they read this action plan, exactly what is happening in the plan. We'd like the plan to consider the ERP, and we'd also like the plan to summarize relevant labor market data that subnational governments, workers, industry can see for themselves, but as they might not have the access to this otherwise, to understand what might be coming in the transition in the coming years. With respect to the Partnership Council, we'd like an expanded requirements for knowledge, expertise, and experience to reflect things such as people, such as rural, remote, and resource-dependent and transitioning communities, newcomers to the Canadian labour market, youth, Indigenous participation and employment in low-carbon industries, and the impacts of high-emitting industries and the transition to a net zero economy on workers, communities, Indigenous peoples, and other underrepresented groups. So expanding the scope of who will sit on that table to include these perspectives in the decisions and advice provided by the council, and also state who the council must engage with, and that includes key stakeholders like unionized and non-unionized workers, partners such as the Net Zero Advisory Body, which we want a very close working relationship between the council and this advisory body, which is established under the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, and finally, Indigenous peoples. With respect to the Secretariat, we would like the responsibilities to be expanded slightly to include things like developing guidance and standards for workforce development across Canada, and connecting youth, newcomers to Canada, workers, communities, Indigenous peoples, and underrepresented groups to programs and funding to support them in the shift to the net zero economy. Some of this might actually be implicit in the job, but it should be explicitly stated to give Canadians a clear understanding of what to expect from this Secretariat. And finally, to boost the capacity of this Secretariat. With respect to reporting, we would like the reports to identify at the mid-year point of the action plan how to update and improve the action plan to ensure that these 5-year action plans stay relevant and maintain an ambitious stance towards advancing the net zero economy. With respect to climate, we would like a greater connection between Bill C-50 and Canada's climate legislation. So that means linking it to Canada's climate targets explicitly and other important aspects of the legislation. For example, as I mentioned, requiring the action plan to consider the emissions reduction plan, but also vice versa, so that the emissions reduction plan is considering the path to a net zero economy set out in this action plan. And referring to the transition away from high emitting industries. And with respect to regional planning, we have proposed a net zero planning agreement in which the federal government, the minister responsible for this legislation, can choose to engage in bilateral agreements with subnational governments, which includes Indigenous and municipal governments, to provide support and funding and technical expertise about how they can mobilize their resources within their own jurisdiction to advance the net zero economy. And in doing so, in line with the goals of this legislation. So I've thrown a lot at you there, but that was the flavor of some of the legislation as we see it and some of the ways that we can improve it. And I look forward to any questions.
Thanks, Matt, for your legal deep dive there. I hope not too many eyes glazed over, but it's helpful, I think, to hear the specifics of the legislation and where organizations are seeing room for improvement. So just a reminder before we go to our last speaker that folks can put questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and right after Ken will go to questions. So I'll introduce Ken Bondi from Unifor. Ken is the national representative for Unifor, the largest private sector union in Canada, consisting of more than 315,000 members working in every sector of the Canadian economy. Ken has represented workers in various capacities for 34 years, and for the past 18 years, Ken has worked at Unifor at the national office in Toronto with the Health, Safety and Environment Department. Over to you, Ken.
Thank you, Laura, for that. And I am speaking to you today from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. So I don't have a PowerPoint presentation today. I wanted to take this opportunity actually to talk about some practical applications of how Bill C-50 can be applied. As Laura mentioned, we are the largest private sector union in Canada, representing 29 major sectors of the economy. And so we're very much connected to the comments that Megan was making in regards to the Pembina study along with the Canadian Labour Congress. I certainly agree with that. And we unfortunately have had to fight a little bit to be included as a labor voice into the consultations to date. And we've always said again that if this legislation is going to take place, it won't have any hope to survive if it doesn't have the input of workers. So we have had those opportunities now, and we appreciate those. And by the way, we've had some consultation, and we do agree with the 10 established points that have been reported through the government on how to reach this transition process. But I wanted to take an opportunity to, as I said, look at what is occurring today. So I know a lot of this focus is on oil and gas and how is a transition situation going to occur there. And we're obviously very concerned. Unifor represents approximately 14,000 oil and gas workers as Canada's premier energy union. So we are looking closely at how our members are going to be sustained and carry on through this process. But what is happening right now today is we are living, as I speak, in a transition process. And that transition process is happening primarily in Ontario, where the auto industry is going through a transition to electric vehicles. In fact, it's not only happening in Ontario, North America, and indeed across the world. Those transitions to electric vehicles are being made. And as we all know, that transition is a result of climate change. Through the pressures that citizens, workers, governments have put on to corporations to say we have to find a cleaner means of transportation that's going to reduce our carbon footprint as people travel across the country and across the world. So the impact of that is obvious as far as our members that we represent in auto, our members that work in the oil and gas industry. An electric vehicle obviously does not have the need to have a lubricant in an internal combustion engine. It doesn't need gas in a gas tank. So the two are working hand in hand, or are connected hand in hand. But let's take a look at what's happening right now. Unifor is in major contract negotiations with the Detroit 3 automakers as we speak. We have just concluded negotiations with Ford Motor Company. What we had to do in this set of negotiations was, as a union, take the responsibility of this transition onto ourselves, where we had to approach the company and we had to ensure through negotiation that workers are not going to be left behind. Because the transition to electric vehicles, despite the way that this is being pitched, is not an easy one. We have had a full transition to electric delivery vehicles being built at GM CAMI facility in Ingersoll, Ontario. But those workers right now are being put out of work for the next 5 months because there was a lack of discussion beforehand on how to transition to those electric vehicles. So what we've seen now is that there is not enough battery components that are being manufactured to put into the vehicles. There's not enough infrastructure across North America to energize those batteries. And so now a transition that was promising a bright future for those workers is being held back by 5 months of workers out of work and trying to survive through that process. Those same processes are going to occur in all of our auto plants that we represent. So what we had to do as a union was to say, look, we have to put protective language into our collective agreements that will, number one, financially support and sustain our members. Otherwise, they'll simply survive on what is still a failing employment insurance program by the federal government. So we had to negotiate monies in addition to that to keep people sustainable economically. And we also had to negotiate protections so that those workers have jobs to come back to, that they are not going to be left out and to the cold. We know that there's going to be a reduction of workforce. How do we address that? Right now, those responsibilities are falling upon our union. Nevertheless, other workplaces that are going to transition that don't have a union to speak for them, what is the possible consequences to them going to be? So we are seeing in real time right now where a failure to have a transition plan is having a negative impact on the workforce and could be worse in the long run as jobs are reduced or they move away, that there is no security system in place. So, you know, the question that we have to ask to the government is, why is this happening? Why is there not a better financial support system recognizing that transition is going to mean job loss or job displacement? We don't need that 5-year program to talk about that. This is happening right now in 2023, and we need to have those discussions now. The other issue or concern that we have is that we are very fortunate to give credit that the federal and provincial governments have provided financial incentives to the corporations to invest, to add to the transition process. But as we move through these sectors, and oil and gas is quite possibly one of them, what is the government's plan to address corporations that may not be sensitive to climate change as much as we are, may not agree with the legislation, and simply shift their investments into other countries that are not at the point that we are today? And I think when we talk about Alberta, we see a lot of that fear mongering that's happening right now. Those are the concerns of the workers out there. I will say clearly that our members that work out in those oil and gas fields, they understand. They understand that there's a need to reduce the carbon footprint. They understand the environmental negative impacts of those operations. They don't own the corporations. They're there to sustain their own life and their family. So as a union, we give them voice and give them opportunity to talk about that. But we are not talking again about how are we going to get to the point of addressing those transitions that are going to happen. What are the opportunities if there is an oil field or a mine that is shut down? What is the opportunity for reclaiming that land, to bringing it back to what it was prior to those operations? Where are there decommissioning funds that can be accessed that will keep workers working as they go through that transition? What is going to happen to a town like Fort McMurray, that if there's a full transition out of oil and gas mining, the bitumen that is in the grounds there, what other industries are going to be encouraged to invest there? How are we going to encourage that investment? How are we going to get them there? How are we going to ensure that the jobs that are being worked in today, those people will continue to receive the same wages and benefits that they are working with today? These are the fears of workers that are going through these transitions. And I'll say it again, is that these workers are not in denial that we have a climate crisis, that we have to change the way that business is done today. But what we need to do is we need a government that is willing to work on these issues right now, today, not a 5-year plan. And having said all of that, I will say what I've said many times in these discussions, is that I know that the government's talking about a secretariat, but we firmly believe this is an issue of such importance to the future of Canada and to the workers of Canada that it deserves its own ministry, and a minister dedicated solely to making sure that this transition process to new sustainable jobs is done right the first time. Let's not make those mistakes that have been made. Let's not make the loss of jobs that have happened in different sectors of our economy in the past a reoccurrence here. So we have to get to the table immediately. We need to open these tripart discussions with the government immediately. And there absolutely has to be transparency with the people of Canada on how this process is being put forth and what the guarantees will be to protect workers' jobs, to protect future generations as we transition to a zero carbon economy. So I'll leave my comments at that, Laura.
Thanks so much, Ken. That is great. Really underscoring the urgency there. And I think the tension that we feel between, wanting to set up having good processes and taking the time to get input on what those processes are, and also the fact that, the transition is underway and workers need that support now. So I would invite our other panelists to turn their cameras back on when you're ready, and we'll go to a couple of questions. While they're doing that, I encourage, we've had a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I encourage audience members to continue adding their questions in the Q&A so we can get to them. But before we go there, maybe I'll ask a couple of questions of my own to get us started. So the first one to you, Megan, I'm wondering, in your experience working on the coal transition, working with the coal transition task force, what you see that we can learn from that transition, which has been sort of underway for a bit longer than the current sustainable jobs policy. What can we learn for this next phase?
Thanks for the question, Laura. It's an important one. This is, in very, very recent history. And I think I'll just start by saying, especially in Alberta, where there's a deregulated electricity market, we've seen private investors respond to this phase out a lot faster than we've seen in other places. So that really has resulted in the fact that a lot of these coal companies are shutting down earlier than what the regulated phase out date is of 2030. So coal is actually expected to end in Alberta by the end of this year, which is 7 years in advance of what the regulations require. And that really just underscores the need to think about these issues from a proactive standpoint. So that's really yesterday. We need to start putting in place investments and things of that nature that actually, begin the dialogue with communities about what they want their futures to look like, and put supports in place for workers to do skills assessments and look at transferable skill pathways to other careers and occupations, bolstering some of the existing federal and provincial dollars that are being put into training programs that will help workers make that shift, and ideally in the places that they live. So that's one element. All of these proactive measures, the thinking and the communication need to be right now. The other thing too, we learned, so again, as Laura provided in the intro, I had the pleasure of traveling alongside the Just Transition Task Force for Coal Power Workers and Communities, and got to sit in on many community consultations. We, at the time, especially, again, I'll use Alberta as kind of an example for this, but the provincial government had already put in a suite of responsive programs. There was a training voucher, there was relocation assistance funding. And so we got the opportunity in Alberta, where there already were some initial supports, to really see where the program gaps, and whether or not programs were being maximized, or if the funding levels were too much or too little, if they were oversubscribed. So the Just Transition Task Force did put forth, I think, a suite of really important and good foundational recommendations to the Government of Canada that would bolster those existing supports in Alberta and nationalize them for other jurisdictions experiencing transition in the coal sector, like Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. But I think what we didn't see, unfortunately, is every single one of those recommendations implemented. And I think there were a number of factors that caused that. There were a few of these things that were advanced, like this commitment to put forth legislation, which we're seeing now. But it really underscores the need to have that whole of government approach to sustainable jobs. The nuance here is that those recommendations were given to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, who doesn't actually have the power to put those programs in place. A lot of those programs are the responsibility of Employment and Social Development Canada, or Natural Resources Canada is also implicated here, the regional development agencies as well, who can kind of support some of the community diversification funding side. And so what we want to see through this act, and through some of the governance implementation mechanisms, is a secretariat that's able to help coordinate and lead and push for that whole of government approach, and to work with other governments who have the actual policy tools at their disposal to actually help workers at the federal level. As well, of course, we want to see workers participating on the Partnership Council. And so when it comes to this council, workers and labor representatives understand those nuances and they know what on the ground transition looks like. So having fair and the right composition of members, particularly from labor, who have sort of seen these waves of transitions occur before, will be another way that we can kind of achieve and learn from the lessons of the coal sector.
Thanks, Megan. That's great. And yeah, I definitely hear you on I know that there was a lot of frustration that the coal task force recommendations were not all implemented, and sort of thinking through what are the implications for the partnership council as it gets set up? How do we make sure that those experts' time and recommendations are being taken seriously and being acted upon by government is a big question that we're looking for in the legislation. So if I could pose one question to you, Kara, around how, given your work with Indigenous communities on the ground in transition, how do you see federal legislation or policies, programs, funding more generally being able to better support communities who are undertaking, leading the energy transition, undertaking these projects on the ground? You are on mute. Oh, now you disappeared. We lost your video feed.
Oh, I hit the wrong button.
There we go.
Sustainable jobs is really important to First Nations, and I think with my experience that the training, the capacity needs to happen in or near the communities. So many education opportunities are in the major cities, and that is often not good for the youth. It's more than they understand, getting them away from their home communities. With I think 592 First Nations across Canada, the highest percentage of them are rural or remote. So focusing on renewable energy, solar, wind, bioheat. Bioheat is such a great opportunity because it creates employment and it reduces diesel. Like solar is wonderful, but it's only a 5-minute job. Bioheat is a year-round job. So that's the biggest thing, is creating meaningful employment. I understand and I sympathize with the loss of so many jobs that are happening here, but also on most First Nations, it's a 90% unemployment rate. So how do we create opportunities for these First Nation people that don't have the same opportunities, the same availability to make a decent, fair wage and have opportunities? Like, a jug of milk here is $14. A loaf of bread here is $10. Like, when we come up here, they're happy to see us. They're happy the things. I heard something on the radio yesterday, and it talked about lower standard, lower employment and higher employment. I don't remember what the word was, but it was like, in a big city, you have 100 tools. Here in the remote community, we have 10. We didn't have an impact gun, so we had to use a ratchet. So something that could have taken 10 minutes took us an hour because we don't have the tools. So now I'll get that up here. So the opportunities for here, it just goes back to improving opportunity. Like I said, the renewable energies, getting good houses. Like houses here, when you look at them and they're brand new built, you would never see that in the South. It just wouldn't happen. Like the contractors wouldn't get paid if things are broken or not working properly, or like I could walk around and look at the brand new houses and the siding is broken, and so it's net zero housing, meaning housing that is verging on being neutral, putting solar on it, but also just having quality, sustainable houses, which will reduce the need for diesel power. Building Indigenous capacity. I don't know what I wrote here. Advance and increase. I don't remember what that note says. I can't understand. But I mean, it's about having meaningful change for the Indigenous people off grid and on grid. Like it's about changing the page. It's about taking these challenges that are going across the country and making things better for First Nations people.
Thanks, Kara. That's great. So we do have some questions coming into the Q&A. So maybe I'll go to the one from Seth here, which speaks to your comments, Ken, on the urgency. So I don't know, Ken or Matt, if you want to chime in here. You know, under the current legislation, we see that the timeline is that the legislation will hope to be passed in spring, and the Partnership Council has stood up. They do engagement with communities and workers, and then the timeline for the first Sustainable Job Action Plan is not until the deadline is not until the end of 2025, and there will be a federal election sometime between now and then, which may upset that process. So how do we how do we make sure that we get to the urgency of the need to support workers now, while also I would add also balancing that need to have widespread engagement, hear from people on the ground, and allow time for that social dialogue to take place.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, Seth, and obviously we are all politically aware of the positions and comments that have come out of whether it's the federal conservatives or provincial conservatives. I think the rhetoric that's coming out of Danielle Smith's office speaks to the challenges that I was raising earlier, that their solution is just to pretend that nothing can be done. A lot of climate change disagreement, and so the answer is to do nothing, and not because they're concerned about the workers, but because they're concerned about corporations' investments, and so that's a very big problem. So one of the things that I think we need to do, and I have been challenging the government on this, is that so currently this file resides with Natural Resources Canada. I don't understand why it's there. The Bill C-50 is the Sustainable Jobs Act. How you are going to deal with legislation and jobs and not include the Minister of Labor is beyond me. If I had my opportunities, I would bring the Ministry of Labor and the Ministry of Environment in with NRCan to work together, and at the risk of creating a bigger bureaucratic nightmare, one of the things that may do is by involving a broader spread of government ministries. If there's a change in government, it may be more difficult to just dissolve this legislation and then carry on to where we were before. But we are adamant that we should be having more involvement with the Ministry of Labor so that they can address those job concerns issues I was talking about earlier. So the only way that I think we're going to do that is through these coalition partners that are here on this screen today, and by workers addressing government directly and demanding that there is a quicker, firmer action taken through their constituencies before we get into a crisis situation.
Thanks, Ken. That's great. I think Megan wanted to add on to this one.
Yes, I did. So I definitely appreciate the question on timelines. It's something we're thinking about quite a bit, and it's just an opportunity to highlight some of the work that some of the NGOs on the call, and including Laura, have been working on behind the scenes with government, and that's as part of the Green Budget Coalition submission, where we're looking at the kind of investments we want to see in the upcoming 2024 budget, which we recognize is a very critical moment for us to start putting in place some of those proactive supports that I was talking about. And in addition to these 5-year incremental Sustainable Jobs Acts, I think, Ken said this before in meetings, but, you know, there's so much going on, and it's such a live issue, and there's so much changing in the economy and in different industries that we're not expecting to see every 5 years massive investments all at once. We do want to see those incremental investments with each budget cycle that occurs. So I think those Sustainable Jobs Acts or the action plans themselves are going to be an opportunity for the government of Canada to, you know, talk about what they've done and kind of add to that transparency and accountability. But the action needs to be constant and ongoing. And not only is it new investments, but it's updating programs and improving those through kind of the regular function of government work.
Thanks, Megan. Before we go to Hadrian's question, just on this note of sort of programs and investments, there's a comment here if anyone has any thoughts on the recent announcement of the Climate Corps jobs trainings, that's like sustainable jobs training for youth that Biden just announced in the US. And I know the Climate Emergency Unit team has a campaign for something similar in Canada. So I don't know if anyone has any comments on that. Ken, great. And yeah, and I think to sort of bridge from what Megan was saying, there is, I think, space for pushing for programs and investments like this that could run in parallel to the legislation process as well. But Ken, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a lot we can learn if you look more closely at the Biden administration on these particular issues, and really not shying away from it. So this is one of those examples where we talk about training, but we don't want to talk about just retraining an aging workforce. We want to retrain, or we want to train up and coming people in their careers. And one of the things that we've talked about at Unifor to address some of the comments that Kara was making is that we have opportunities that need to be funded so that people can develop better ways to generate electricity in our native lands, better ways to drill wells, better ways to look at expanding green technologies everywhere, but particularly in our territories where, as Kara said, a lot of folks are struggling, or things are out of balance in the necessities that they need because of their locale. So this is the kind of thing that I would see a lot of enthusiasm and energy from young folks training and learning on how they can incorporate this stuff and not just stay in the city, but get out and beyond.
Thanks, Ken. And yeah, going back to Kara's point about the need to have training like this, you know, be accessible to communities, be out in First Nations, in rural areas where, you know, people don't have to travel and relocate to have access to that training. Megan, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I do. Sorry to be, I'm quite keen on all of these questions. So I think what comes to mind when I look at this program is some of the programs that we've seen in other jurisdictions in Canada that have been put in place in the past to respond to regional transitions. So it made me think of, there was I think it was back in the 90s, they put in place a program to help forest sector workers who were being transitioned as a result of some manufacturing facility closures. And what I think they were trying to do with this program, the name's escaping me, but they funneled a lot of these workers towards tree planting. And if you don't have a good understanding of the composition and demographics of your workforce, there can be potential fatal flaws in programs like this. So when you're looking at the composition and demographic of a forest sector manufacturing facility, a lot of these workers are, you know, folks who maybe left high school to join the to join the forest sector. They're coming towards the end of their careers, and they may just not be physically capable of undertaking work like, that requires for tree planting, which is seasonal gig work. It's low paid work. So I think when I look at a program like what President Biden's announced, it's really ensuring that this program is designed well, and that workers that are participating are getting the kind of credentials that are going to set them up for like the rest of their lives. If it's youth that they're targeting, we want to see, you know, youth getting the kinds of red seal trade skilling. If they're going towards something, you know, if rather than sort of kind of ad hoc short-term training solutions that won't necessarily translate from industry to industry. And we also want to see, you know, if they're seeking to re-employ workers who are affected or displaced through different kinds of transitions unfolding across the country, that their needs are taken into consideration and they're given meaningful work, decent work standards. And I think that is one thing that President Biden is quite strong on, is ensuring that these clean economy jobs are, you know, supported by unions. He's been a big advocate and supporter of the strikes that are ongoing in the auto manufacturing sector, and recognizing the need for these workers to be protected and for industries that, you know, not to take advantage of this transition as a way to reduce wages and labor standards as part of the transition.
Thanks, Megan. So we'll go to a question from Hadrian here around negative emissions technology. So if anyone has comments on how we respond to the growing allure of negative emissions technologies such as carbon capture and storage, which we see increasing attention to and investment from different levels of government these days, which you know, take some of the urgency off of the need to transition and sort of either delay or sort of diminish the need to transition our high emitting industries. Matt?
Yeah, thanks. And great question. I think I'll just preface my comments by saying that this legislation can't and shouldn't be expected to do everything we want to see in a just transition. Even if we get it to what we think is a perfect place, it's not going to be the solution for a just transition. And knowing your background, I don't think you're expecting that either. But I will say, with respect to CCS and these types of technologies, negative emission technologies, I think to improve this legislation to mitigate against that risk, I would like to see a clear definition of a net zero economy that prioritizes a pathway to 1.5 degrees, to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. I'd like to see an economy that prioritizes emission reductions over removals. I'd like to see a definition of sustainable jobs that directs the creation of jobs towards things that are truly sustainable. And for example, carbon capture in an oil sands facility will reduce the emissions from that facility. But if it facilitates additional expansion of oil production from that facility, it will make the climate crisis worse. And it will not address the issues of habitat destruction and reclamation liability from tailings ponds that will expand as oil production expands. So I think that's why a useful and clear definition of sustainable jobs is so important in this legislation. I'd also say there's other things outside of the legislation that we should advocate for. Emissions targets should be structured provincially and nationally to have both targets for reduction of emissions and a maximum threshold of reductions for removals. So, for example, if we're going to get to net zero by 2050 nationally, how much are we willing to let carbon removals do that work? And we should limit that to ensure that we prioritize the most effective and certain response to climate change, which are emission reductions. So I think there's a number of things we can do outside of this legislation, but within this act, we should focus on, I think, a definition of net zero economy and sustainable jobs.
Thanks, Matt. And just in our last 5 minutes here, I have one more question for Kara around if you have any thoughts on how the government could better engage, work with First Nations and Indigenous communities who are leading the energy transition, who have energy projects going on, to make sure that this legislation and their future work, does meet the needs of those communities and supports, recognizes the work that's already going on.
So Indigenous clean energy, we've been since 2016. So each year there's been 20 catalysts, and each of the catalysts are working on different projects. And the biggest thing, of course, everybody's biggest thing always is funding. But for example, here in Pekanjikam, like I said, I've been here 5 years, and now the youth know what to do. They understand the changes of the seasons, you need to harvest in the summer so that it's drying, dry wood for the winter, they've got one building full of firewood to sell. So it took, in 2017, 18, I came up 1 week a month spending time with them. The funders asked me for a formal curriculum. Well, I don't have a formal curriculum. I know it needs to be done, and I help them do it. And they learn at a different speed, and they learn different ways. So one of the first times I was here, they didn't know what a tape measure was. They didn't know how to work a drill. So I need to start at a level that works for each of them. So I'm here in Pekanjikam this week. The boiler is doing great. Next week, we're going to Kichinume-Kusib, and I'm bringing my youth from Pekanjikam to there to train those youth. So the government wants this train the trainer mentor type thing, except they make it so hard for me to get it going that, I need more money. So I do a lot of things on my own time, on my own dime, because it needs to happen and it's important. So I think that one, they need to make things more accessible. One of the things I wrote was that here in Pekanjikam, we did computer training for a year. So my 8 youth got a laptop. So they learned basic Excel, Word, how to send an email. But the youth in Kichinume-Kusib, they don't have laptops. So they can't do a proposal. And then the government loves those fancy Excel or PDF sites. They're locked and they're whatever. Well, they can't open them. So I need a document signed, and they can't open the document. So then I have to send it in a different format. So there's things that we take for granted that just aren't the same here. So I think that, obviously we need more money. Obviously we need more time. It didn't happen as fast here as it would in the South. I chose to work in the North, and when you work in the North, you have to leave yourself at home. You have to forget how everything is done and do it the way that they do it, and then it'll happen. But if you try to make it your way, it won't happen. So I think the answer is youth, change your perspective, always funding, and making it a little bit easier to access, that they can do it, that they don't need me doing proposals and reports.
Yeah, that's a great point, that there needs to be more flexibility. And I think that's something that can be brought into the legislation as it moves through amendments, and also we'll be looking for in the budget, making budget recommendations for funding as well, building that flexibility in and and limiting the bureaucracy and the red tape around these programs in order to ensure that they can roll out with the urgency and with the accessibility that is needed to really see a just transition happen.
And sorry, to add to that, there was the note about the red seal. Red seal is wonderful if you can read a test, if you can do a test. Red seals need to be more of a verbal type test, more of a hands-on type test. I think so many more people would be able to do these things if they weren't so tied to a book. And that really is a challenge for a lot of people. It's just not where they're strong.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks, Kara. Well, thank you so much again to our speakers. We're just at the end of our time here. Thanks for all that you shared. We covered a lot of ground, from on the ground community projects to workers bargaining at the bargaining table to really legislative details, legal details. So we'll definitely keep this conversation going and potentially host another panel later this fall as we move through the amendments process. But thanks again for joining. Thanks to our audience. If you have any questions for any of the speakers or for us, feel free to follow up with me at IASD, and I can connect the dots here. Thanks, everyone. Take care.